Good afternoon, Baiba and Sebastian.
Hallo Christopher, guten Morgen aus Deutschland, aus München.
Labrit, Christopher, and hello, Sebastian. Good afternoon. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Sebastian Wolf, who has been professor of advertising and strategic brand management at Stuttgart Media University for almost 4 years. Earlier in his career, he worked as a strategy and creative director for brands and communication, spending almost 5 years at Serviceplan Group and later at Territory. He has been awarded by, among others, the ADC, Cannes Lion, and Eurobest. So now Christopher will ask the opening question.
Again, thank you for being here, Sebastian. And we know you're an expert on this particular topic, so we're very excited about bringing you in. And also, you've spent time in this messy middle, both as a practitioner, but now as a longtime esteemed academic. And some marketers have read evidence-based theory, but not enough. But of those, far fewer know how to use it under pressure in a real meeting with a real brand or with a real budget or with real people who still speak in different kinds of marketing languages and use different terms. We'd love to hear from you what makes translating theory into practice often so difficult.
Yeah, I think the first problem is to really understand what evidence-based marketing really means, and also to differentiate it to data-driven marketing, because many practitioners believe it's the same, and that when they handle data and if they measure everything very precisely, they are already doing some kind of evidence-based marketing. And it's difficult sometimes to explain that evidence-based marketing is not just working with data or just looking at facts and using them for your strategic decisions, but to know empirical generalizations and to employ those laws, those general patterns to your strategic decisions. This is the first misunderstanding by many practitioners, I think, which one has to clear up when one wants to speak the same language. That makes sense.
And we'll continue on this topic. I think that you touched something incredibly important because there is also this some sort of observation in the market that data overrides theory, or data is now more important than the theory, and theory is pushed away because now data proves everything. Do you agree or disagree with this?
Well, yeah, I do agree that there is some kind of data fetishism around in agencies, but also marketing departments. I also call it precision fetishism because, especially in digital marketing, you have so many measures, so many KPIs, which are measurable very precisely. But as the old saying goes, it's sometimes more important to measure something loosely that's important than to measure something very specifically, which is completely unimportant. And I think there really is a false prioritization of what to measure, what to look at, what to optimize for with many practitioners in marketing departments and in agencies.
They see their dashboards as this sort of single source of truth that they can look at on a daily basis. And like you said, because it's data, it seems like it's evidence. But if it's in from their own backyard, with their own biases, within their own timeframes, it's perhaps something that's way more elusive than evidence. When practitioners decide then what counts as strong enough evidence, especially when you're dealing with qualitative research, again, these dashboards, these KPIs, surveys, behavioral data, what is it that you've seen or your advice as to how to measure what is strong, what is weak, how to help counsel someone to get a better compass or anchor on that topic?
What you need is a good understanding of a kind of hierarchy of different KPIs and an understanding of what drives what, basically, which lower order KPIs or which lower order impacts, effects drive higher order effects. In the end, what you want to achieve in marketing is more sales or higher prices, or at least keep the level you already have if you are a mature brand in a mature market. But this is nothing you can achieve directly through marketing measures throughout the whole, all of the 4 Ps. But since this is my focus, especially not through advertising. And so what you need to find is direct impact of advertising measures of a campaign, of which can be a rather brand focused campaign or a performance focused campaign. See what are the important effects you can achieve directly and how they relate to those higher order measures. And then you can define different key performance indicators, different numbers you want to hit. And this should be like a kind of zero budgeting strategy. You really have to start from the objectives you want to achieve, and there is no one size fits all KPI stack that works for every company in every situation. You really have to, I think, start from scratch and look at the brief actually, and ask why are we doing this campaign, doing this advertising campaign? What is the end goal we want to achieve, and what are the shorter time frame impacts, shorter time frame effects we want to achieve? Like it could be even a click. A click is much more worthy than a engagement measure, like when you're in social media, for example. So that would be something you can optimize for, because we know that it helps to sell stuff in the end. Another point is you can't really achieve increased brand awareness in a short term of a week or so that a campaign runs. So you have to find some kind of controlling mechanism until you really see the needle move in these longer term KPIs. And that could even be qualitative measurements, like how much do people like the campaign. And then maybe engagement could be worthwhile to measure, because if people like a campaign, that may in the end turn into increased brand awareness because it better sticks in people's memories and so on and so forth. To have this KPI stack with different levels of importance and also different time frames, I think that's the challenge, how to define that.
May I go back to the topic about the fluency and translation? I'd really love to get your opinion or your take on this, some sort of like idea that a lot of practitioners think or they perceive that academical language is very slow and very kind of abstract, and how to turn it into more actionable and more kind of like interesting for the practitioners.
I think there are 2 kinds of difficulties, at least in the German academic world and the German practitioners world. There is the hardcore academic language, which is completely disconnected from what really happens in the world. Different words, terms, different concepts, and nobody in an agency I worked in uses the concepts I came to know from academic literature. And I think that basically the same is true for marketing departments. On the client side, I didn't find people using those terms. And then there's this, I'd say, soft academic language, where sometimes practitioners do general studies like Binet and Field and so on and so forth, where they share a common language with practitioners, and this can more easily be incorporated into the day-to-day work. It would be nice if the academic language and the language of practitioners would share more common ground, or if there were more initiatives like yours to translate those languages into each other. And at least from the academic side, there are lots of colleagues who are trying to do that. We are even researching why that doesn't really work, why trying to build bridges from the academic world into the practitioner's world doesn't really work. And there are many different reasons, and they are really hard to overcome. So actually, I think to start from the practitioner's view, like you guys are doing, and trying to bring academics into the practitioners discussion is more worthwhile than going the other way around and being an academic who tries to educate the practitioners about how to understand their concepts and so on and so forth. But in the end, we have to meet somewhere in the middle, right? We have to translate one language into the other, and everyone must be open to understand the other side of the conversation.
Part of the issue with the translation piece that you just referred to was maybe one of our favorite parts of a recent podcast that you're on. And so listeners, you're missing out if you've not checked out Olaf Hartmann's Markencraft podcast. He interviewed Sebastian recently, and it's in the German language, although there's some wonderful episodes with some very familiar names also in English, so check it out. But maybe to pick up on that point, talk about the whole penguin translation concept that both you spoke of, because I think it nicely reflects that the issue with the bridge.
I think the penguin was Olaf's example, and I try to repeat it in more philosophical terms. As your listeners may not know, I studied philosophy and did my PhD in philosophy many decades ago. And there's this principal problem of the story goes like this. Thomas Cook, I think, was it, who came to Australia as the first adventurer to set foot on the continent. And then he saw a kangaroo. And he asked one of the natives there, "What is that?" And the native said, "Kangaroo." And he thought, okay, that's a kangaroo. But actually, what the native was saying was, "I don't understand you." And we all know that the animal is still called kangaroo. I don't know if this is some kind of urban myth, actually, but it's a nice story because in the end it says you don't really know what the other person is saying if you don't really have a longer conversation and if you don't have a common ground to really find out what you are talking about. And this is also called the Gavagai problem in philosophy, where the example in the article is a rabbit. And in the end, if you call the thing, the animal, rabbit, you don't really know if you are talking about the rabbit as a whole or about some not disconnected part of the rabbit, because it's always the same. You can't really find out what you're talking about because you will always be pointing at the same thing. And so to bring that down to marketing, if you point at something and you say, this is a, I don't know, creative, like the content of a piece of advertising, and somebody else says, yeah, that's creative, you can still be misunderstanding each other in fundamental ways because one is talking about, I don't know, the colors, how it makes him or her feel, and the other one is talking about the message, the content. And when one says that's great and the other one says great, they may still be talking past each other. So it's really it's a principal problem to really understand each other. And you can only overcome this problem when you talk with each other for some time. It's like colors. You guys probably see the word a little bit different than I do because every eye is a little bit different, every brain is a little bit different. I can't really know how you perceive the world. It's another philosophical side note, that's the qualia problem. But it doesn't matter because if I point to something green and you don't have a green-red issue, we probably can differentiate between green and red and blue and black things, and there's no problem in our conversation. But in marketing, there often are. And in especially creative processes, in my experience, those surface at a very late stage when you try to come up with a campaign. When you start with a brief, everyone says, yeah, I think we know where we're going. I know what the objectives are. I know what a good campaign is. And then when the campaign is almost finished, the first concepts are on the table. Suddenly the client and the agency realize that they are completely talking past each other the whole time. So that's the problem, I guess.
We heard the feedback from someone who works in Hamburg and is also from Germany that there are certain words that doesn't land in the German language, for example, like the word salience. It doesn't have some sort of emotional meaning in the German language.
Yeah, actually, I'm not so sure if salience in the meaning in evidence-based marketing even has such a great impact in English. I think it's just a difficult term, so to speak. What I try to tell my students, even though salience isn't even that important anymore because they changed salience to mental availability in the Ehrenberg-Bass lingo, is hervorstechend. So does it pop out, right? Does your brand pop out in the sense of, does it have some relevance? Does it pop into your consciousness because the product feels relevant in some buying situation? Or does it pop out of the shelf? Does it pop out of the TV advertising block where it's advertised? So that's one of the possibilities to translate something that sounds rather academic into more common language. Yeah, and it's the same thing, of course, with German language in academia, because you have to know that when I wrote my PhD, the guidance how to write a PhD was the book, at least in philosophy, write books. 1/3 of the book has to be just repeating what was already there, just explaining some history about the concepts you're elaborating on. 1/3 should be new, your own thinking, new concepts, new ideas, and 1/3 should be ununderstandable. It should be so new, so different that nobody understands it. Of course, that's speaking a little bit hyperbolic, but one point about academics is they signal that they are very smart if only few people understand what they are saying. And that's, of course, a contradiction if you want to make your theories apply to practitioners and to the practical world. So that's kind of a contradiction. The smarter your theory is, the harder it is to apply it in practice.
I can confirm that salience is also a mess of a word in particularly American English. The best someone can get is breakthrough, which sounds very similar to the German word that you put out there, in which case it's usually always executional. For example, the Cadbury Gorilla ad, right? That would be considered very salient. But its ability to break through or pop to mind at a particular buying occasion and how it's being used in that regard, that's often something that people have a hard time putting together. So persuasion versus salience, it's like maybe that gives it a counterpoint to give it some kind of an anchor. But yes, even in American English, it is oftentimes, it adds to the confusion. I mean, are there other vague marketing concepts or words that you have seen or rotate around your own practice, or you see challenging your own students that don't actually sort of land? They're just forever just kind of stuck in the mess.
There are two very basic concepts I talk about a lot and I think a lot about, which are brand and creativity. Let's start with brand. I think there's much confusion about the term brand itself. There are basically three understandings of what the term brand means. It can mean just the company, like the brand Apple has a high valued stock at the stock market, or the brand XYZ has to let go of 2,000 employees, something like that. That's when we talk about the company. Then, of course, we talk about the image, the perception of the company, which is what brand managers are usually concerned with. The brand is very sympathetic. It has a friendly personality or very serious personality, stuff like that. And what lawyers and finance people are concerned with is the communication, which can be, what's it called, not patented, but it can be copyrighted. Certain colors can be copyrighted, certain claims can be copyrighted, brand characters, for example, you can have copyright on them. And that's why you can own them, similar to patents. And they, of course, help you to shape the image of the company. So, of course, all three meanings are somehow connected, but they're all different. Since we're talking about evidence-based marketing and about how brands grow in particular, the funny thing is, I just wrote a LinkedIn post about that, is that Byron Sharp is mostly talking about brands in the sense of companies, because he's talking about how companies grow market share. And he's not talking about brands in the sense of perception, how much people are aware of a brand, how they perceive the brand, and how many situations or contexts. That's all covered with the term mental availability. And those are two different things in the evidence-based marketing from the Ehrenberg Bass Institute. When I'm looking at the brand literature in Germany, they are talking mostly about the image aspect of brand. Especially the identity-based theory is concerned with how can I influence the perception of my company through being authentic in my communication. And the image is one side of this brand concept, and that's really important. But when you talk to people in a marketing department, they often say something like brand is this logo, these colors, basically their corporate identity guidelines. And so that's some kind of confusion already with such a basic concept, I think. How is that in English? How do you perceive that? Do you sometimes run into problems when you try to talk about brand at all? Or do you think that through the context, it's usually clear what you're talking about?
I think the biggest problem is by understanding on what level the client is, on what level they are thinking about the brand. The brand is the logo, or brand is part of every decision that the company is making. And I think from there, you can understand also some sort of fluency on the client team, like how good they are talking in the brand language, if I could call it like that.
Yeah, that's true. Sometimes, especially B2B companies talk about their brand, even though they don't have a brand, because there is no awareness, no differentiating perception, and they just mean their brand guidelines, their color codes and stuff like that. And on the other hand, when you go into a finance call of some public traded company, they talk about brand, but they don't mean their brand, they just mean the company. That's a little bit of a problem. Sometimes, or most of the time, through the context, it's clear what you're talking about. But especially when you have a longer conversation, also with my students, they always change the context and they jump from one category to the other. And that's a problem to be very precise in also your strategy, because it also has to do with the KPIs we talked about earlier, because market share is something you achieve on the company level. Doesn't really have to do anything with the image itself, but you can increase your market share if your brand in the sense of perception becomes stronger. So if you increase mental availability, you have a good chance of increasing market share. And you wouldn't say, I strengthen my brand through my brand. That doesn't really make sense. You have to say, I strengthen my company through strengthening my mental availability. And that's why I think it's important to at least be aware of this confusion with the term and to maybe use different words or to be very clear what you're talking about. The other thing that I'm really concerned with is creativity, because it's mostly misunderstood, I think, even in academic literature and in reports where market research companies try to measure creativity. I mean, since I was a creative for a dozen or so years, this is really close to my heart. And I want to tell people the more creative a campaign is, the higher the chance that it will have a positive effect. Basically, that's not always true, but in general, it is true. But one has to understand what creativity means in such a sentence. And most people, and also even some marketing research companies, say the concept of creativity consists of basically two parts. One is originality, and the other one is relevance. And of course, there's some kind of tension. Sometimes something is very relevant, but it's completely boring, and something very interesting or surprising may not be relevant. And so you should find a middle ground. That's the idea with many people when they talk about creativity. But I don't think that's a useful explanation of what creativity is, because in normal language, when we just live our lives outside of marketing, we often say something is creative without it being relevant at all. When we talk about the little painting my kids are doing, I would say, oh, that's creative, but that doesn't have any relevance whatsoever. And I still would say that this is not a completely different concept of creativity than that we are using in marketing. There is a very close connection. Or when you go into a museum, you often see very similar images by the same artist, where you wouldn't say they are very original in a sense, because they are so similar. Not every painting is completely new, you know? Picasso's blue face, for example. If you look at them very shortly, they look all the same, basically. So even originality may not be the full explanation of what creativity means. And I think that's really interesting, and it does tell us something about what role creativity plays in marketing and in advertising too. So I think we should keep the relevance aspect out of the creativity concept, and we should think about what else besides originality also makes up for creativity. And I think that's basically artistry, attention to detail, some kind of human perspective, some kind of emotion, empathy, things like that. Since the concept hasn't been defined really in all of these measurements of the impact of creativity, there's no real evidence or proof that this kind of creativity really has an impact on business outcomes. And that's something I want to explore when I get to it, when I have some more time, because I'm really convinced that the artistry part, together with the originality part, completely apart from the relevance part, does have a really strong impact on business results in most cases.
Would totally love to support you in pushing ahead into that particular space. There was a recent episode we did with Edmunds Vanags, who is a clinical researcher in psychology, so not within our advertising bubble, someone who's dedicated his adult life to just studying memory and emotion. And I think you touched on something there that is worthy of much further investigation, because if you think of the concept of the brain as a forecasting or predictive engine, it's constantly trying to model ahead of us what it is that we're going to expect. When we experience something that does not fit the model, that becomes very memorable, right? Because we're forecasting something and something else happens. And so the concept of originality or breaking from a predictive norm actually has very, very, very strong memory making power. And so having that aspect, and we talk about salience then in that regard, it gives it a new sort of operational function. And so it feels like it could literally at a physiological level be the thing, the novelty that works by simply stopping us in our tracks and giving us a moment to actually take in the moment. But too often creativity is used around concepts like magic and art, which are often words used to turn off conversation.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, these are things we can't understand because I'm going to use the word magic, or I'm going to suggest the supernaturals at to play. And usually that's about stopping understanding. And so too often we don't get deep enough into that, but there could be an interesting gap or bridge to make between those two psychological phenomena, a very physiological response, and then getting back to the real power or craft or that can go into the detail of the actual creativity that could bring that memory making power.
Yes, absolutely. I think when it comes to the originality part of the concept of creativity, that is rather neatly explained in psychology, for example. I mean, it's like you can tell an evolutionary story. If you're walking through the jungle, everything is green, everything is fine. You're just walking your path, and then a yellow tiger comes out of the green jungle, and suddenly you stop, and there's some kind of danger. Everything that's different is some kind of danger, and you are aware of it. And if you are with a pal by the tiger, you will, of course, remember tigers are no good. You will not forget that. So I think that's a very easy, it's easy to explain why originality has an impact on memory. And That's why for all campaigns that are having memory as an objective, originality is important. Not all campaigns do have that objective because performance campaigns are working immediately, but all brand building campaigns, as I say, they do have that objective, and that's why originality is important for those campaigns. When it comes to the artistry, or what you called the magic or the unexplainable, I think that's really where it gets interesting and where it really gets also harder to explain, where that may be important too, because it's definitely difficult to measure. Originality is still easy to measure. You know, it's about similarity or dissimilarities and so on and so forth. But how to say something has a artistic maturity, for example, is very difficult. To say something has a personal style is very difficult to say. But what we also know from psychology is that, and I think that also has to do with behavioral economics a little bit, because to start from the other side, behavioral economics tells us something about bounded rationality. For example, that we perceive things to have a higher quality when they have a higher price, when they are presented in a more valuable fashion. For example, if we see a brand advertising with out-of-home campaigns, we already think that it must be of high quality because we know that out-of-home advertising is quite expensive. And I think artistic value is doing the same thing. It signals that some creatives or some decision makers thought it to be worth their while to take some more time to execute this campaign, to invest a little bit more to make something more beautiful. And that's, I think, why some studies say that campaigns work more effectively and also more efficiently when they have some kind of additional artistic value where you can't explain why this is done just because someone thought it's more beautiful like that. And this is in our digital world where everything has to be measured very precisely and where everything is more rational, gets overlooked a lot. And I think that's where a lot of potential can be found to make basically the world and the advertising world a little bit more beautiful because it actually works better.
I think that there's a huge debate in academia about the innovation and the AI. And I think that in this context, it's very interesting to also maybe to ask you this question, because you have worked as a creative and now you are working in academia. And then there's, as I said, like this conversation that if the students will be using more AI tools more often, there will be less of innovation or possibility to even generate some sort of like new things. What is your take on this from your perspective?
Generally speaking, it depends on how they use artificial intelligence. There are at least two different topics there, I think. The one is human creativity different to artificial creativity in the sense that artificial intelligence can only recompose things that have already been there. And I think that's not a categorical difference between human and artificial intelligence, because humans also always have to rely on their past experiences. In one of my definitions of creativity, it's just combination of different things that haven't been combined this way before. So there's no godlike spark that brings something completely new into the world through creativity. It's always combination of things that have already been there. There's nothing new under the sun, so to speak. And that's true for both. So I don't think that artificial intelligence is conceptually different to human intelligence there, or that it's more difficult to come up with innovations with the help of artificial intelligence. The other problem is that if we create with artificial intelligence, or if we let artificial intelligence create for us, it will be reiterating itself all the time. And then you will run into this Xerox problem, so to speak. If you have a copy of an image and you copy it again and you copy the copy and you copy the copy, it becomes worse with every copy. And I think that's a problem with artificial intelligence. So in that sense, I do think that it is a problem to rely on artificial intelligence too much. I think most people who are using artificial intelligence now to create something are using it as a kind of sparring partner. They are not relying completely on some algorithmic solutions. They still want to keep themselves as a human in the loop. At least that's how I use it, and also how my students are using it most of the time, at least. I think that's very useful. It helps us to get to interesting things faster, because the level where you start really thinking about new things is much faster to reach, so to speak. In the olden days, you were thinking with your art partner for 2 hours just to get all the bad ideas out of your system. And now you just prompt an AI tool and they will come up with all the bad ideas in an instant. And from that, you can then start to come up with more interesting things. So I wouldn't say that AI presents a problem for innovation or for creative ideas.
One of the things that helped YouTube take off was just the simple question, how do I do this? And because there was an opportunity to go see someone, how do I fix this? How do I make this? And suddenly you're in someone's garage or in their hobby room and they were showing you how to do it. You could learn this from another person through observation. One of the leading queries on KI or AI is, what does this mean? Or what's this all about? And so they're using it like a generative search engine. But the irony of asking AI about what something means when it itself does not hold any meaning, its ability to understand or deduce meaning could probably add to a lot of distortion in terms of translation. Because the question, what does this mean, is essentially inherently a question about someone trying to understand something, not just know it, but maybe understand something. Curious to hear, particularly given your philosophical background, where you see the concept of then translating within marketing and knowing that more and more marketers might be relying on AI as a means to say, well, what does mental availability mean? Or what does this mean? Or what does it mean for my brand? Or what does my brand mean?
Yeah. I think that there's a big problem there, because that's something I see with my students sometimes. To understand concepts with the help of AI, in my experience, you already have to be an expert in that domain. And it sounds a little bit contradictory, but I think it's really important, because only then you can check if the AI is talking nonsense. The answers you get from the artificial intelligence are only as good as your questions. And you have to ask very specific questions, and you also have to know how to ask a question to find out if the AI is really knowing what it's talking about, so to speak. For it really only makes sense to ask for the meaning of some concept or some academic terms if you basically know a little bit about the domain already. So yeah, that basically leads back to what I said earlier. It's more like a study buddy. If you're a student and you have no idea what happened in the lecture, you have to rely completely blindly on what your buddy who attended the lecture is telling you what the answers in the examination will be. And you are not really smart if you completely rely on the guy, because maybe he's just lying to you and he didn't attend the lecture himself. You never know. And it really happens with students. And that's basically how it is with artificial intelligence too. You don't really know if they know what they're talking about. You have to do a little bit of work yourself to check on the AI.
I agree. But I think that there are like, we had this conversation with Christopher that there are like more and more people who are also like applying even for a job, and they are just reading some sort of answers that AI is like sharing based on the question that the interviewer is like, asking. And then you can also understand through the conversation only that how the person thinks and on what level their mind is, or on what level their understanding is.
I mean, that's, of course, a big problem for us professors at a university or high school, because we often have homework as an examination. How do we know that people are actually writing that themselves? Do they have to write it themselves? It's also an open question. Or is it also a skill that is worthy to compose a text with the help of AI? I do think so, that it is an important skill. But sometimes we just want to know if people have the ability to, structure a text, structure their thinking, write it down, and so on and so forth. It's not easy to ask questions in such a way that you can really judge that through a homework. You have to ask very specific questions, and you have to ask questions on topics where there actually is no right or wrong, because then you get more into an essay kind of text and not a just repeating what they've read in some textbooks. They have to make up their mind themselves. They have to structure the logical thinking and so on and so forth. And that's not something that artificial intelligence is very good at. And at least in examinations, they have to apply the context you specifically taught them in class. And I guess if you want to find good people for your company and they applied with some kind of written task, you have to ask them very specific questions. So they have to apply maybe what they heard from the artificial intelligence to that specific context. And you have to ask about their opinions and things like that. And then you can really judge if they are good for the job or not. But it's really difficult to get around these easy AI solutions that people are, of course, using all the time. And one more thing about that, why it is such a big problem that you have to have domain expertise when you are trying to learn something with AI. It's a little bit like the Dunning-Kruger problem. The less you know, the less you are aware that you should know something before you use AI. So the most stupid people rely on AI still. And there's no way of telling them actually, because they are, well, too stupid or too less knowledgeable to really understand that.
We all aspire to the reverse Dunning-Kruger effect, where you've gone so deep, you now have more questions and realize how little you do know. But now that's when you really entered the depths of understanding, way far from the surface where the things blow in the wind. It's the things that are seeping down into the core that are really starting to challenge or open up new lines of investigation.
I mean, that's what Socrates said. I only know that I know nothing. And he was quite knowledgeable. And he said that because there was so much he didn't know, that it's basically nothing that he knows. And maybe there is some hope that this kind of thinking gets spread even more because of artificial intelligence, because now people think that data literacy may be important even in schools for young kids to understand that they can't take anything that comes from an AI engine on face value. But actually, it's a problem we had long before artificial intelligence, that you can't actually just take anything in the world on face value. You always have to be a critical thinker and you have to make up your own mind. And maybe since many people are running into problems using AI, there will be more awareness of this problem about critical thinking, about data literacy and stuff like that.
I think this has always been a big problem that people
Yes.
don't want to be a critical thinkers. They want to just, my apologies to say this, be lazy. Not stupid, but just be lazy, that it's like, oh, it's just so easy to ask for the answer and the answer, boom, is there. And it's just much harder to sit down and reflect and take some time and, go deep into some topic. And I do believe that we are also living in a very fast-paced time And I think that even practitioners are losing this extra time to think deeper or think more critically about the stuff that they are doing. And I do believe that we are all kind of creating some sort of future that maybe we will not be happy about.
I mean, we are, as humans, cognitive misers, as Byron Sharp also says. We don't want to, or we shouldn't use too much energy for thinking if we don't have to, using heuristics all the time. And often that works fine, but sometimes we should, move into system 2 and think a bit more hardly. And so this is a human problem, if you want to say it like that. But through our business world, that makes it even more difficult, because everything has to be efficient, every solution has to be found as quickly as possible, and so on and so forth. And there's no real incentive to take time to find better solutions. Sometimes there are, but often there are not. When I talk to my students in their first semester, I ask them if they are rather thinkers or doers. And I split them into 2 groups then. And I tell them, okay, the doers are basically the Google people and the thinkers are the Apple people. So Google is just, they are launching beta versions of all kinds of apps and then they see how it runs. And Apple is measure twice, cut once. And I think we should be more like measure thrice, so to speak, measure 3 times and cut once. But usually that doesn't happen.
This might be a bonus question, but something you might also have an expert point of view on, given you're working with students who are naturally bringing in a beginner mindset. But curious to hear your reflection on how the value of maintaining a beginner mindset, even much more senior and mature in your career, where it's way too easy to calcify this kind of performative mastery of, I already know everything. And back to your point, what got me here is going to get me there, of the prescription of maintaining a beginner mindset and how you might encourage that among people regardless of age.
Yeah, well, of course, it's important to maintain that beginner mindset. It's also part of critical thinking, just never to rely on your expert opinion, but always to question that and to have some eagerness to find out something new and to look at everything like a child. I think that's important. But I think that especially in advertising, it's even more important. What I see with my students is when I show them some classic TV advertisements, they often react completely different than I did at the time or as I still see them. For example, the gorilla ad, the Cadbury gorilla ad, I always show that in my first semester course on foundations of advertising. And when they watch the gorilla, they hear the music, and then the gorilla starts drumming on his set, and they are quite entertained. And then the Cadbury pack shot is zoomed in, and they all start to laugh. They don't really understand what this was supposed to be. And I think already in their first semester, just because they are sitting in an advertising course, they think that has to make sense. There has to be a message that is delivered from the company to the audience, and this message has to be clear. And that's why they are surprised that this is advertising that can work. And already at that point, I have to unlearn them that advertising can work just by creating a feeling that is associated with the brand name. On the other hand, there's this famous spot with the colorful balls in San Francisco for Sony Bravia, color like no other TVs. Great music too. And I think the spot is 2 minutes and it's like a music video basically. You hear great music and you see all these bouncy balls, thousands of them bouncing down the hills of San Francisco. And it takes 2 minutes and they are very unimpressed, those Gen Z students, with this spot. It takes too long for them. They wonder, when does it end? What's the message? And I think they have a point. It probably wouldn't land as good today as it did when it was published, because, attention is different. And that's where I have to unlearn a little bit, because I always thought that's a greatest of all time TV advertisement that will work forever. But media landscape and use of media has changed so much, it probably wouldn't work as well today as it did 20 years ago. That's something I have to unlearn. And that's, of course, also one reason why I became a professor, because, being confronted with these young people helps with that.
You touched the term that we are keeping very dear into our podcast, the unlearning topic. So just to kind of go into this phase where we can kind of like come closer to the end of our conversation, that I will ask you, like, since you are now a professor in a university and you are surrounded with a lot of young talent still who are learning communication and advertising, what are your other unlearnings so far in your journey?
What did I unlearn? That some things that seem trivial to me are not trivial at all. So sometimes you really have to start from scratch when you want to teach young people about advertising, just because, it starts with their media usage behavior. Many of our students have a perception of advertising that is basically social media. They do know, of course, that there are legacy media channels and that their parents are watching TV and stuff like that, but they are not really aware how big TV still is and how many rules that are true for TV advertising are still valuable for social video advertising and stuff like that. One has to really get into the perspective of these young people and unlearn all the stuff that I have experienced to really be able to teach them why it's important, I think. What I also had to unlearn is that at least my students, but I think young people in general, they want to have clear-cut solutions or clear-cut answers to their questions. It's very hard for them to hold different truths at the same time, especially when it comes to brand management theories. We were talking about different perspectives like market-based assets theory, identity-based brand management, and the legacy STP framework. And they all are some kind of true. All of them are taught in our studies, but in certain aspects, they contradict each other. And that's really hard for young people to grasp. For me as a philosopher by training, that's the easiest thing, because, in philosophy, there's no truth. There's only the path towards truth, basically. When you get into a program like advertising, that's not something you want to bother with, that there are contrasting things or contradictory things that may be true both at the same time. That's hard to grasp. And that's something I had to unlearn from my philosophy training, to accept that it's difficult for the students, that I have to explain why that is the case, why they have to make up their own mind about which perspective they prefer, which they find more convincing, and so on and so forth.
For those who want to stay in touch with Dr. Sebastian Wolf, we're going to ask you that question about how to do that. But we can also just give a firm endorsement that to follow Sebastian on LinkedIn is to also open yourself up to lots of wonderful comments and other articles or things that he's paying attention to. I know Baiba and myself have been a beneficiary of being connected and following him for some time now. And again, it really does add value and nourishes your daily feed if you're the type of person that hangs out on LinkedIn. So yeah, just to close it out, how can we get more of this beyond this podcast?
Since the organic reach of LinkedIn has dropped quite a lot lately, I'm kind of have the feeling that I'm just pushing my topics and my babblings into the ether and nobody reads it. But it's nice that you say that. Yeah, I'm trying to provide some value on LinkedIn, so everyone is invited to follow me, and I'm happy to get new connections there. I'm easy to find, I think, even though the name Sebastian Wolf is quite common. It's Professor Dr. Sebastian Wolf in Germany, and I'm a marketing professor, so it should be easy to find. Yeah, follow me there. Apart from that, my program at the University for Applied Sciences in Stuttgart, we are doing cooperations with real clients, real world clients, where my students in their last semester try to break a brief for clients for a rather small fee. We're building each semester a kind of small advertising agency with all the departments you need, because our program is quite diversified. So we have strategists, project managers, we have art directors, copywriters. And for every project, we can basically help clients to solve rather small to middle-sized briefs during one semester, which is half a year. I'm always looking for new cooperation partners and interesting brands, be they small or big. So please get in touch if you're interested in that. And since I'm a professor at a university for applied sciences, I'm always trying to have one foot at least still in the business, in the industry. And if there are marketing challenges you're having, advertising challenges, I'm always happy to help on a freelance basis as a consultant or also as a creative director or strategy director. So if you need any help there, please get in touch and we can figure out to do it through the university with my student teams or with me directly.
It was our pleasure to have a chat with you, Sebastian. We have met before in private conversations, you and us, brandLingual, and it has always been a very inspiring conversations. And you have always inspired us to think more and think deeper. And thank you for that. And also thank you for accepting this invitation to be with us today.
I have to say that I'm very proud that you invited me into your podcast. I follow both of you for some time now, especially you, Baiba. I think you're providing immense value for the marketing community worldwide, actually. I was really nervous because you two are so smart people, and I hope I did my best at least to answer your questions. I hope that provided some value too. So thank you again for having me.
We were a little bit insecure also on our end.
Okay. Thank you. So we'll see each other quite soon then.
Let's keep the dialogue open.
Sure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye then.